In the first video of the Considering Corinthians series, we learned how Paul visited Corinth for the first time during his second missionary journey. When he was there, he stayed at least 18 months during the years 50 to 52 AD. Now, he then set out on his third missionary journey, probably later in 52 AD, and passing through Galatia and Phrygia, he came to Ephesus either towards the end of 52 AD or the start of 53 AD. Now, it was probably during the time that he was in Ephesus that he wrote a letter to the Corinthians in which he told them not to company with fornicators. We read about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, and it's an instruction that they seem to have misunderstood. It was also during this time that he received a letter from the Corinthians, the things whereof ye wrote unto me, he refers to in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. He also heard the report from the house of Chloe about the contentions in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11. And he received a visit from Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, which we read about in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 17. Now, following this, what we call 1 Corinthians was written. When he wrote that letter, Paul appears to have already sent Timothy to Corinth. We read about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. And he sent him via Macedonia, as we read in Acts chapter 19. So he hadn't yet arrived at the time that the Corinthians received the letter. What happened next is unclear, but there are three possibilities. So the first of these is that given the disorderly situation in Corinth, Paul changed his plans to go straight there and decided to go via Macedonia, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 5. He would do that after he had finished his work in Ephesus, and we read that in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 15. This would give them time to reflect on his letter. This view is that they responded positively to the letter, and 2 Corinthians was written when Paul received that report of this from Titus. Second idea is that Paul delayed going to Corinth but received word, possibly from Timothy, that 1 Corinthians had not been well received. So as a result of that, he wrote another letter from Ephesus with many tears, as we read about in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 4, and really to know whether they would be obedient in all things, as verse 9 of chapter 2 says. That letter may have been delivered by Titus, and this occasioned his visit to Corinth. Now, a variation of this is that when Paul heard that 1 Corinthians had not been well received, he went straight to Corinth, but it was a brief, painful visit. He refers to a visit in heaviness in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1. And then Paul returned to Ephesus from where he wrote the letter referred to in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 4. There's no record of such a visit in Acts, but 2 Corinthians does twice refer to him coming to them the third time in chapter 12, verse 14, and chapter 13, verse 1. Now, I hope I haven't lost you in talking about those three options. Whatever the case was, Paul was very concerned at their response to his letter, so much so that he couldn't settle to get on with gospel work at Troas. I had no rest in my spirit because I found not Titus my brother, he writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 13. So instead he headed on to Philippi in the hope that he would meet up with Titus sooner. And Titus brought good news to Paul. The assembly had come to their senses and had dealt with a major problem in the assembly. Paul was greatly comforted by this news and decided that he would proceed to go to Corinth. And the visit to Corinth is very briefly referred to in Acts chapter 20, verses 2 and 3. When he had gone over those parts and had given them much exhortation, he came into Greece and there abode for 3 months. His joy at Titus's news was so great that he was moved to write 2 Corinthians. His joy occupies the first part of the letter, chapters 1 to 7, and we might just call it Paul's comfort and their restoration. Now, as he proceeded to Corinth, Paul thought that he might bring some of the Macedonian brethren with him. He writes about that in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 4. In view of this, Paul impressed upon the Corinthians the importance of fulfilling their previous readiness to minister to the needs of the poor believers in Jerusalem. He deals with this in the middle section of the letter in chapters 8 and 9, which we might call Paul's counsel and their readiness. However, it is apparent that there was a residual resistance to Paul in Corinth. While the majority responded positively to Paul's teaching and his overtures, there were still some who refused to accept his apostolic authority and continued to tolerate sin. Dealing with this resistance occupies the final and the third part of the letter, chapters 10 to 13. We might call this Paul's concern and their resistance. So that's an overview of really what 2 Corinthians is about and how it came to be written. In the next video, we will begin searching 2 Corinthians, and I pray that the Lord will bless his word to us as we proceed in his will.